Chapter 3 of Letters from Mrs Palmerston to her Daughter, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Fletcher. Chapter 3. The Influence of Bad Example, or the History of Miss Sable. My dear Eliza, you will not, I trust, suspect me of wishing to censure without solid and sufficient grounds. I am perhaps more gratified by your progress in that which is good and laudable than you are yourself, from being more capable of appreciating the advantages which will result to you in a future day from the improvement of the present hour. But youth and inexperience subject you to error, and from that it is my duty and my ardent wish to save you. The instant that you regard my admonitions in any other point of view than as friendly cautions intended to secure your happiness, you defeat the salutary purpose of my affectionate care. Nay, you do more. You convert a real and essential good into the pernicious means of fostering in your heart discontent and ingratitude to your best and truest friend. You will insensibly become obstinate, and those indiscretions which now only demand your attention in order to correct them will become incorrigible. Young people are naturally unsuspecting and credulous, subject to sudden impulses, and amongst the dangers to which youth and innocence are exposed, I fear we must place some to the account of these common traits of ingenuous and uncorrupted nature. It is a painful lesson for the child of simplicity to learn that there is in the world such a thing as guile. Truth and artless confidence reject with disdain the idea of deceit and treachery. They look within their own pure abode, and they pronounce all without to be fair and good. You passed 3 days in the society of Miss Charlotte Standford, and you asserted that she was one of the most amiable and best disposed girls in the whole world. She was all perfection, and you felicitated yourself on the pleasure and manifold advantages you should derive from her being your near neighbour, and you concluded by saying, "Surely, mamma, the friendship of such a young person as Miss Standford is inestimable." If I mistake not, 1 little month only has elapsed since the date of your letter which contained this eulogy on Miss Charlotte Standford. The last time she was with us, I became accidentally acquainted with the motives which led you to pronounce, without any qualifications whatever, Miss Standford a very wicked girl. I happened to be in the summer-house when you and your dear friend passed under the window, which was open. She was expecting her aunt every instant, who was, as you know, to call for her in her way to Mrs B.'s, where they still remain. You stopped exactly under the window to compose a bouquet for your favourite, and lamented in very lively terms your approaching separation. "Oh, do not let it vex you," cried your sprightly companion. "In the holidays my aunt will have you at the lodge. She says that she'll take no denial from Mrs Palmerston. We shall then have a whole month's enjoyment, and nothing to do or think of but pleasure." You laughed, and said a week's such holidays would tire me to death, for I have been so accustomed to fill up my time that idleness seems to me the dullest thing in the world. "What?" asked Charlotte with vivacity. "Do you never find a holiday pleasant?" "Oh, yes," answered you with naivete, "when I earn one by my diligence, for then I pass more hours with my mother and grandfather in the evening." "Well," said your giddy friend, "it is amazing to me how you contrive to keep up your spirits under such continual restraints. I should hate such a mother as yours." The roses dropped from your hand, and with honest resentment you turned to your indiscreet companion, saying, "Miss Sandford, you have very much deceived me. I am very angry, and I shall never forget or forgive what you have said." She attempted to divert your displeasure, and said, "Oh, nonsense! Who but you would take offence where none was meant? If you be satisfied with being in the stocks from morning to night, it's nothing to me. I only know that I could not and would not submit." You instantly took the path to the house, observing you believed that I should be waiting for you. I have, my dear Eliza, been thus circumstantial in my account of this scene for 2 reasons. The first is to give you the pleasure of knowing that you had, though unconsciously, given to your mother a test of your affection and principles, which filled her heart with joy and hope. The second arises from your having preferred for the confidant of your change of opinion relative to Miss Stanford, your maid-servant to your mother. Betty told me this morning, as a secret, that she fancied you and Miss Charlotte had not parted friends, for that after she had quitted the house you went to your room, and Betty found you weeping, that, supposing you regretted the loss of your lively companion, she began to console you by saying that you would soon meet again, when, to her surprise, you answered, "I hope, Betty, I shall not meet Miss Stanford any more. She is a very wicked, dangerous girl, and I'm only astonished that I ever liked her." "I pressed Miss Palmerston," continued the worthy girl, "to tell me what had happened, but she only said, 'Pray do not ask me any questions. I cannot bear to hear her name, nor that my mamma should know how little I understood this girl's true character.'" I will not interrupt the course of this letter by animadverting on your reposing your confidence rather in Betty's prudence than mine. I am willing to believe that this preference arose from your delicacy in sparing to me an evidence that I was thought, even by a Miss Charlotte Stanford, a too austere and rigid governess. But my design is to examine whether there has not entered into your prudence for me a false shame, and a reluctance to the confession that your judgment of Miss Stanford had been too hastily pronounced, and that from your sudden partiality in her favour, and as sudden a dislike of her, might not arise a well-grounded suspicion that you were capricious and childish. Your self-love has taken the alarm, and you are not only displeased with Charlotte for not knowing Mrs. Palmerston better, but also for placing Eliza Palmerston in the humiliating predicament of being obliged to confess that she is liable to error. Yet, my beloved child, your mother tells you that your first mistake relative to Charlotte's pretensions to your kindness is much more entitled to lenity than the latter, which so severely condemns her. It is not easy at any period of life to judge of our fellow creatures' claims to our esteem and confidence. Appearances are always more or less deceitful when taken by youth and inexperience as unerring guides to conclusions which inclination directs. You were pleased with the apparent good nature and harmless gaiety of Charlotte Stanford. You were won by her kindness to you, delighted by having within your reach a friend of your own age, and further stimulated by a good heart and the incident at the cottage which so honourably bore testimony of her humanity to the poor, you pronounced her faultless and the very best girl in the world. Yielding to resentment and vexation on discovering that she was not faultless, you have pronounced her a very wicked and dangerous girl. But the truth is, my Eliza, she is neither the one nor the other of these characters, but is of that class of being to whom you and myself belong, and with whom as social beings we must live. Charlotte's cheerful good humour and heedless vivacity constitute at present her merit and also her crime. When she said that she hated your mother, she only meant to express her aversion to restraint and rooted dislike to those avocations which have improvement for their object. Time is necessary in order to determine our judgment in regard to this young creature's future character, but I will boldly predict that neither a good understanding nor a good heart will secure her safety unless she can acquire the habits of industry and of obedience and docility to those whom God has appointed for the guides of her youth, and who, it may be presumed, are wiser as well as more experienced than herself. This little incident has, however, an important lesson annexed to it, and my Eliza will, I trust, profit from it. Experience will rectify these mistakes of a youthful enthusiasm, but she is often a very severe monitress, and it not unfrequently happens that she arrives too late to save our tranquillity and our innocence. Profit, then, my child, from her lessons under the security of a parent's love and milder instructions. There are many people in the world who may be said to have no character at all. Such will neither interest nor offend you. But there are still more from whom you ought always to hold yourself at a distance until you've examined their opinions, their sentiments, but above all their conduct. For, incredible as it may appear to you, some will mislead you from motives of envy, others from the suggestions of a base interest, and others again from having no principles of virtue in themselves, and from having therefore ceased to respect it in their intercourse with the world around them, and multitudes are to be met with, who from ignorance will lead you into the paths of vice, or from the inconsideration and levity of their own minds will conduct yours to a servile and senseless submission to the follies of fashionable life. 3 simple rules I now offer to you, persuaded as I am that they contain in them no contemptible preservatives for that youth and simplicity so much the object of my solicitude. I entreat you, my dear child, to consider them with attention, and carefully to retain them in your mind. First, consider from whom the advice comes which claims your attention, and, it may be, meets your inclination. Are they entitled by their age, by their situation and experience of life, by their knowledge, and the interest they ought to have in your happiness, to implicit confidence? Secondly, is the advice given such as, without any reluctance or concealment, you would communicate to your mother or to any other tried and sure friend? Thirdly, is the advice given more calculated to flatter your inclinations than to repress them? And does it contain motives for practising the poor subterfuges of cunning or incitements to disobedience? Your adherence to the first of these rules, indeed I may include all, depends on your firmness and discretion. Remember that ignorance cannot guide you. With secrecy is always to be implied something wrong to conceal, and when inclination meets the counsel to deceive, be at once on your guard. The last caution powerfully calls upon you for all the principles of your mind, and a forgetfulness of these will conduct you to a precipice from which perhaps no friendly hand may be able to save you or shelter you from the arrogant triumph of those who directed your inexperienced and deviating steps, and who will exult in your fall. But it is certain, if your life be preserved, and we will presume to trust to Providence for its continuance, that you will have, and that very soon, your part and your place in this mixed scene. The question ought to be, and I think will naturally arise in my Eliza's mind, what is the course that will best secure me from the snares of the wicked and the dangers of the heedless? I answer, a decided character, built on the principles of religion and supported by a well-exercised reason. With these guards you will be safe. Your conduct, not your censures, will put folly to the blush, and vice will retire from your severe but not uncharitable rebukes. Be prepared to encounter in your journey through life those dangers common to the children of dust. Pity weakness, error, and ignorance. Seek in your own breast the apology these will need. remembering that you are under no other obligation at present than to correct your own faults. Your post is not that of public or private censor. I believe there is no better guide to the knowledge of our own characters than that of impartially and strictly examining the motives which influence us when we yield to the temptation of exposing the foibles or condemning the moral deviations of our fellow creatures. For of one truth we are certain: pure and genuine virtue is gentle and forbearing. She neither heedlessly censures nor harshly reprobates. Steady in her own allotted path, she can from afar see the hapless wanderer, and with pity will recall her steps, if it be possible. She knows the peril of that chart also, in which too much confidence may lead to destruction, and where too much caution and suspicion must check the courage of the adventurer, and unnerve him in a course by which alone the end and purpose of rational existence can be attained. I send you, my beloved and still innocent girl, a little narrative, which will, I trust, inculcate more strongly than my precepts those lessons of caution. For it is a painful office, my child, to draw aside the veil which conceals from the pure of heart the defects of human conduct, to chill the unsuspecting confidence of ingenuous youth, and to strip virtue of that garland which her youthful votaries imagine must distinguish her in this world and bloom unfaded to eternity. Alas, my child, these sanguine hopes must be disappointed, but the Christian faith unfolds the future scene, and we have only to press forward and receive the recompense of well-doing by following the steps of him who is our leader and our salvation, and who has prepared us to meet contradiction and offence from evil-doers. Mr. and Mrs. Sable were a very amiable and virtuous couple. They had married young, and it might be said with truth that they entered into active life at the same time, for they had till their union lived very retired, and in a part of the country very remote from London. Their parents, with more rigid prudence than good sense, had debarred them from the amusements within their reach, and to this injudicious prohibition it was probably owing that they regarded the death of their parents as somewhat like an emancipation from captivity, and thought of little with an interest equal to what they felt in the opportunity of gratifying their curiosity and taste by the pleasures of the capital. They found themselves freed from every restraint but the gentle one of mutual affection, which imposed no alloy on their sanguine and eager hopes of pleasure. They were soon established in London, in that style and with those accommodations which an abundant fortune so easily commands everywhere. With false estimates of life, with imaginations warm and unchecked, with all the genuine features of uncorrupted nature and the confidence of youth, they commenced their fashionable career. Friends multiplied daily. Mrs. Sable's parties became brilliant and numerous. The winter flew on downy wings. Bath in the spring and Brighton in the summer succeeded, until fashion and their friends recalled them to town. Some few years at length dispelled this delusion. Mrs. Sable's delicate health yielded to the effects of late hours and crowded apartments, and declined daily. Mr. Sable found London expensive, and his steward a stupid fellow. They discovered what this honest man had perceived for some time, that they had wasted their fortune to please others more than themselves, that they had distinguished by the title of friends their idle associates in amusement, that they had been pillaged by their servants, had been the dupes of fools, and the pity of the wise and respectable. They now looked back on the safe retreat which had been the scene of their happy days, and which they had with such improvident haste quitted for balls and private suppers, crowded with guests whose very faces and names they were strangers to. Happily, with these convictions of their sober thoughts, they found their integrity and honour still unimpeached, and they resolved on quitting London. They mentioned their intention to their general society, and the motives of it to such as shared their more particular confidence and domestic enjoyments. The malicious pity of the first, and the wretched and base expedients suggested by the latter, stung their sensibility to the quick, and roused to indignation the natural rectitude of their minds. All the gay and delusive ideas they had adopted of the world vanished, and made room for more sober and just impressions. But with these entered conclusions not less erroneous than those they had so indignantly discarded. They now persuaded themselves that there was neither truth nor friendship in the human heart, because they had not found them in the haunts of fashion, nor in the senseless round of dissipation. The death of a great-uncle at this crisis placed Mr. Sable once more at his ease in pecuniary matters. This relation he had never seen. His character was singular, and his tastes romantic. With very superior talents, he had acquired opinions which opened his heart to ambition. His career in life was honourable till he arrived at his 40th year, but it never reached his views or hopes. Disappointed in his expectations of a post which he had long solicited, and which he had regarded as all that was necessary to his well-supported claims for reputation and advancement, he retired with dignity from that he enjoyed, and, disgusted with the world, sought his paternal estate in one of the most beautiful spots in North Wales. His chagrin insensibly gave place to his fancy, and he soon raised a paradise about him. The house had the simple appearance of a thatched farm, and old Mr. Sable, with scrupulous attention, gave to all that surrounded it the same modest traits. But his taste was not confined to simplicity in the decorations within the house. These were elegant, and a library that would have graced a palace was the common sitting-room of Mr. Sable. His unsocial temper and the singular retirement of the spot procured him the name of the Hermit, and his habitation was known by no other title than the Hermitage. He was attended by 4 Welsh servants, and on an annual income of £500 grew rich without care, forgetting and forgotten. Near as the connection of blood was, it may be presumed that the features of the two Mr. Sable's minds had also a near affinity and resemblance, for the young man determined on living as much the recluse as his uncle had done. Mrs. Sable loved her husband tenderly. Their mutual errors had united more powerfully their hearts and their opinions. Her health was become extremely delicate, and repose and tranquillity, whilst they renewed her strength, confirmed daily her taste for retirement, and her husband's relish for the pursuits of the garden and his little farm. They had also a blessing not overlooked in their new arrangements. To this they turned with fond delight, as the object that would banish from their retreat all that retirement has to apprehend, and they exulted in a prospect that offered them a secure shelter from the storms of life and the treachery of man, and in which their innocent child would share their safety and their peace. Caroline Sable was 4 years old when her parents reached the Hermitage. They had taken no servants with them, and Caroline, on her arrival, found that she had a new language to learn, for except by an old woman who had for many years been housekeeper, not a word of English was spoken or understood. The little Caroline soon acquired that which cost her father and mother both time and labour, and she was highly flattered in being for a season the common interpreter to the family. Mrs. Sable now devoted her time to her child. She diligently applied every talent she possessed to the improvement of Caroline. These were by no means incompetent to the duty, and they enlarged in proportion as they were exercised. Content shed its balmy influence, renewed health invigorated the feeble frame of Mrs. Sable, and the happy husband blessed the hour that had thus ensured his comforts. 7 or 8 years passed tranquilly over this happy child. She grew in native simplicity and sportive ease. No temptation assailed her, no evil came near her dwelling. Placid and serene, contented and cheerful, she met the kindness of her parents, in whom she saw the mild virtues which she copied. To deceive, or to be deceived, was a lesson that never reached her. To succour the wretched was the recompense of her docility, and the society of her parents included in it all the pleasure and joy she coveted. The sudden death of Mrs. Sable broke down this fragile structure of happiness and security. An ulcerated sore throat hurried this amiable woman to her grave, and Mr. Sable, yielding without resistance to the unexpected blow, was delirious and in the utmost danger. The good housekeeper, unequal to such exigencies, sought the advice of the rector of a large town some miles distant from the Hermitage, with whom she had lived in her youth, and who had recommended her to old Mr. Sable. Dr. Floyd and his lady answered Mrs. Gwynne's letter in person, and by their humane attentions probably saved the unhappy father of poor Caroline. Engaged by their goodness, and soothed by their sympathy, Mr. Sable once more opened his heart to the consolations and comforts of friendship. He solicited their society, and from that time their intercourse became intimate. In the following spring Mr. Sable was prevailed upon by the importunities of his worthy friends to visit the Continent, in order to re-establish his health, and to divert that melancholy which they saw with concern yielded but slowly to the influence of time, or to their salutary efforts. The expediency of placing Caroline in a good school was strenuously urged by Mrs. Floyd, and every advantage she might be expected to reap from such a change in her situation was placed against that absence from which her fond father shrunk. At length he reluctantly yielded, and placing his daughter in a well-recommended school near London, and providing with anxious solicitude for her comforts and even her wishes, he set out for Calais. The kindness of the lady to whose care Caroline was consigned soon dissipated her first emotions of sorrow on losing sight of her father. The novelty of her situation diverted her mind, her companions amused her, and above all, her bedfellow sympathized with her in the frequent and secret tears she shed to the memory of her mother. Miss Parker was her friend, her consolation, and the guileless Caroline opened her whole heart to this amiable inmate. But it was to perfidy and meanness that she had consigned her honest love. Mr. Sable had been profuse in his attentions to his darling Caroline. He had given her, with a purse liberally filled, a number of little trinkets of her mother's, and Miss Parker, although not older than Miss Sable, was much more cunning. She saw at once all the profits that would arise from her attaching herself to a girl who valued money only as the means of serving and obliging others, and who affixed no consequence to the trinkets because she had her mother's picture always in her bosom. She therefore sedulously endeavoured to gain the love and gratitude of the artless Caroline, and with these easily drew from her several presents not inconsiderable in their value. This generosity on the one hand, and the apparent design on the other, were not unobserved in the school. Combinations were hatched to destroy the influence of Miss Parker, with the view of sharing in the spoils. Poor Caroline, who knew not that envy and malice, selfishness and falsehood had their votaries of all ages and in all conditions, repeated to her injured friend the cautions and the charges which the young ladies had communicated to her in order to lessen the regard and kindness that subsisted between them. She was somewhat surprised to find that Miss Parker laughed at her seriousness and braved the malice of the girls, and was utterly confounded when, on their being taxed by her friend with having spoken ill of her, she heard them with effrontery deny what they had repeatedly told her. This storm was, however, soon appeased. Miss Parker still triumphed, but her gentle and insidious influence now gave place to assumed power, and she taught poor Caroline to fear her. The purse of Miss Sable was not inexhaustible. She had shared her last guinea with her friend. Repayment had been the condition. Absolute poverty brought this promise to Caroline's memory. She had seen the weekly fruit and cake basket shared without her participation by those who purchased its contents with her money. Miss Parker displayed with much ostentation a guinea that her aunt, as usual, had given her on calling to see her, and Caroline joyfully saw her difficulties removed. She timidly reminded Miss Parker of her engagement, and requested that she would pay her the half-guinea she had borrowed. Judge of the sensations of this innocent girl when she heard Miss Parker firmly disown having ever received sixpence from her. The poor girl actually became faint and ill. Her indisposition, and the cause of it, instantly reached the governess's ear, who with the most anxious attention sought to know the truth of the matter. Unfortunately, she mistook the blushes of resentment and terror for those of guilt, and poor Caroline was more than the suspected culprit. The attendant ladies of the house saw not the business in the same point of view. One of them, from whom I received this account, was perfectly acquainted with Miss Parker's talents and happy address, and possessed sufficient discernment to have investigated the truth in a different way had she had the authority. But in this instance, as in many others, the offence was better known than the offender. It had not unfrequently happened during this period that the teachers referred themselves to the mild and simple Caroline for that truth which they wished to discover. They had applied to her in doubtful and ambiguous circumstances, because they were certain of sincere and unqualified truth. This might be useful to them, but it was inconvenient to Miss Sable. She was upbraided by the sufferer, called a tell-tale by her schoolfellows, and fell into neglect and contempt. Insensibly these consequences produced their effects. She grew more circumspect, answered evasively, suppressed the truth, and at length gave up her integrity by deviating into falsehoods in order to screen her companions from reproof and shame, and to secure to herself their kindness. What was at first their profit and security became in time her own, and she ceased to make any scruple of availing herself of those pitiful subterfuges which she once regarded as an indelible stain on that mind which for a moment could stoop to employ them. The innocence of Miss Sable was now more than invaded. The first and great barrier was broken down, and she who could escape punishment by telling an untruth was not likely to avoid that misconduct which would otherwise have called for correction. I shall finish the history of her depravity with one more trait. Amongst the assistant masters who attended the school was a poor asthmatic and deformed man. He was distinguished by his skill in drawing and writing, and not less for his mild and patient assiduity in the improvement of his pupils. The young ladies very ingeniously found out that this worthy man, when provoked by their impertinence, stammered, and made very diverting contortions of countenance. To make Mr. Powell stammer became the joke of the hour. Caroline's excellent nature for a long time revolted against this cruel and insulting indecorum. At length it yielded, and she enjoyed in her turn the supreme pleasure of wringing from industry and talents the sweetest recompense they know, namely peace and well-merited praise. The amiable lady to whom I before alluded told me that she had laboured to prevent this cruel levity, that with her remonstrances she had used arguments of the most serious weight. She informed the ladies that this unfortunate man's personal infirmities arose from his having had at an early period of his life a paralytic stroke, and that from thence it happened that every sudden emotion or vexation produced the effects which they had noticed. She therefore entreated them to spare him in future, and to remember that his health and life depended on the composure of his mind, that he had 4 children to support, and had lately lost an excellent wife, which had greatly contributed to that irritation of nerves which so much excited their idle curiosity and unfeeling mirth. "I confess, madam," added the amiable young woman, when she had finished this affecting story, "I gave up Miss Caroline Sable from the hour I discovered that these additional motives for consideration were lost upon her, and that she was totally unmindful of them the next time Mr. Powell attended." At the expiration of 3 years, Mr. Sable returned with exulting joy to meet his child and future prop in life. She struck his admiring eyes with all the exterior charms of youth and with all the graces of a highly finished person. Her accomplishments announced the taste and attention of those who had superintended her education, and elate with hope he conducted her to the Hermitage, in order to enjoy undisturbed for some time his restored treasure. But that retreat was no less changed in the eyes of Caroline than she was become an unfit inmate of it. Her tender father saw her discontent, and eagerly sought for her those amusements within their reach. These were such as the county town afforded, and he was neither displeased nor surprised by the avidity with which she engaged in them. A young ensign whom she had occasionally danced with at the assembly became very assiduous in his attentions to the beautiful Caroline, and so troublesome a visitor to the father that he expressed his disapprobation of him in express terms to his daughter, and not much less ambiguously to the gallant by the coldness and reserve of his behaviour. Caroline, who it is more than probable was at first attracted by the only merit he had, a genteel person and a scarlet coat, found in the disapprobation of her father a stimulus to her growing attachment, and soon after she had reached her 18th year, left clandestinely the natural guardian of her happiness and honour to reflect alone on the deviating child of his hopes and cares. But Mr. Sable's heart was not formed for unpitying resentment. He received his penitent daughter, a widow at 23 years of age, with an infant at her breast and sinking under distress and fatigue. He received her like a ministering angel, and soothed her with a parent's love. "We have," said he, "both erred, and we have both suffered. In the duties we owe to this helpless being, we will mutually engage to rectify our mistakes. You will teach her what is the bitterness of that repentance which follows abandoning a parent to gratify a transient inclination, which in most instances derives its strength more from opposition than from any decided preference of the heart. I will, if Heaven permit, impart to her, with the examples of virtue, a knowledge of those dangers that lie in wait to surprise her. Yes," added he, with emotions he could not suppress, "she shall be taught by me to understand that the innocence of the dove must in this world's warfare be defended by the wisdom of the serpent, to know that vice lurks in every path, and that virtue has to combat with a host of foes. Alas, my dear Caroline, your guides did only half their duty. Restored to peace themselves by their escape from the snares and dangers of the world, they forgot that you had your destined course through its perils. This precious child shall be made acquainted with its specious allurements and fallacious promises. Religion shall be her shield, and we will be her defence, till with steady feet she can stand the onset of passion and the attacks of sin." The unfortunate Caroline Sable had been perverted, but the early impressions of virtue were not erased. She lived some years after her husband's decease, but her health and spirits were broken by a repentance rendered more acute by the proofs she daily received of her father's undiminished affection. She saw that his cheerfulness was often assumed, and in his tenderness a constant apprehension lest she should think him unhappy. The confidence resulting from undeviating duty was lost, and a secret regret poisoned poor Caroline's comforts. In her last illness she particularly recommended Miss Lexford, the teacher in the boarding school where she had been placed, to her father's notice, and mentioned with emotion the superior talents and experience of this young woman. "As a proof of her merit," added she, "I loved her till I was unworthy of her regard. I then feared her penetration, but never could arraign her justice or complain of her severity." She was invited to the Hermitage immediately after Caroline's death, and had resided with Mr. Sable some years, when I accidentally met her with her pupil at a friend's house, where we passed a month with reciprocal satisfaction. I have only time this morning to recommend the little story before you to your serious attention, and remain your affectionate mother, Angelica Palmerston. End of Chapter 3.